Hello, so today we're going to be going over the items in set 13, and this is going to be a little bit of an item tier list. This was something that I was asked to do when I was doing some of the other tier lists, so I finally got around to doing it. And basically, this is going to be a nice, lighthearted, fun tier list. It's not going to be super detailed and in-depth. I'm going to try and give examples and justifications of why I usually make certain items over other ones, depending on the spot that I have in a game. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel. I usually do more detailed guides where I go into particular comps, or I give patch note reviews, or I try and give general tips like how different mechanics of the game of TFT work. All of those guides are available on my channel as well as through playlists. If you're looking for additional stuff, you can also join via memberships because I do extra content. I'm going to try and ramp up the amount of members content that I do as soon as possible. And then also there's coaching available through membership. And then there's also my art store, which you can check out because I do art on the side as well. In terms of videos as well, subscribing really helps me out. So please make sure to like and subscribe. As a small content creator, it helps me quite a bit. So if you like my content, if you're a returning viewer, please make sure to do that. Now, let's get back to the tier list. Now, before we start the tier list, I want to be very, very clear. This is mostly for fun. Every item has its purpose. Every item has its use. I think items in general are pretty well balanced across the board, and they're very situational to your augment, your anomaly, the board that you're playing, the units you're playing, the synergies that you have in. A lot of the items that I talk about in my item guides on my item playlist, so you can check those out if you want a much more detailed understanding of how to use items and which items to make and when to make them. This is just going to be me ranking them in a more fun way. As you can see, I'm not trying to clickbait and make it like S to A tier. I'm trying to make it as informative as possible. Basically, every item that you make, it's basically like how reliable of a slam it is, if it's really flexible, if it's strong for the components that you're using, if those components aren't better used elsewhere, and if it doesn't require as much justification. So that's why I have my tier list set up as such, to try and describe these tiers in that way. So now let's get through it, and you'll see what I mean as we go through the items. I'm just going to go in the order that they are here. I don't know what the sorting is, but it's just the sorting that I had. So first item, Warmogs. Warmogs to me is situationally good. There are some units that use it really well. Whenever you have a really strong tank, like a Sentinel tank, Warmogs is great because it scales up their HP massively. It uses belts, which aren't too high value of a component. Usually belts, however, are more utility focused, right? They usually allow you to make Sundering, like through Even Shroud. It can help you to make other items that are really good, like Redemption. It can help you to make like utility items. Chainmail, with a chainmail, it can make Sunfire. So a lot of times, if you make a Warmog early, you might cut out your opportunity to make other items that might be a little bit more flexible. So it cuts out some of your flexible options, because belt is a great way to kill other components or to deal with other components that you have. So that's why it's only in situationally good. It's not a tank item that I would instantly slam because the components might have use other places. Another item that's like that is Adaptive Helm. Adaptive Helm is really good on units that are in the front line that want to cast. It gives a bunch of armor as well as the ability to generate mana, which some units really like. Something like Elise, if you think about Elise as one of her best items, because when you have frontline Elise, the main thing you want to do is cast, and if possible, cast multiple times, because her stunning could often lead you to winning a round. Like one Elise stun, hitting a backline carry, GG, you can win the round off of that. So it's an extremely powerful item. But something I talk about Adaptive Helm a lot in my itemization guides on my channel, and I always recommend beginners, hey, be careful if you're making Adaptive Helm, because Adaptive Helm, the components that it uses is a tier and a cloak. And a tier and a cloak are two components that you need to use either to make a static shiv or an ionic spark, which are your only ways of getting shred to reduce magic resist. So if you're playing an AP comp and you make an Adaptive Helm, you might not be able to very readily make shred for your board, and that might hurt your max cap, and it can also be very detrimental in certain lobbies. For that reason, it's situationally good. Some units, some spots, just a lot of value. If you're playing AD, it's a really good slam because it often fits in really nicely, but situational. You don't want to always just instantly make it unless you have a reason to make it. Jewel Gauntlet, I'm going to put in probably good. So something that we're going to talk about a lot in this tier list is the glove item. The glove item is a little bit hard to use sometimes, right? Glove items on their own don't do all that much because they give you a little bit of crit chance, which doesn't matter too much unless your unit is a major auto attacker. A lot of times in TFT, most of the damage that your units do are either going to be doing from repeated auto attacks, which is a couple units. It's much more less common. Or they're going to be doing damage via casting an ult and doing a massive damage with their ult. Jewel Gauntlet is good because it takes that glove component, which is often hard to deal with in some cases, and by using just one rod, which often you're using to make your AP builds, you now allow your abilities to crit. That's actually really good on a lot of comps like Sorks, even Visionaries, even Dominators. There's a lot of ways of getting a massive amount of AP or getting a massive amount of casts off, and scaling that up by making the abilities crit is actually pretty good. And the reason it's in the probably making / good tier is not because Jewel Gauntlet itself is a broken item. It's not like the best item you can make. Like in a lot of cases, if you have the option of like tit for tat making a Jewel Gauntlet or like a Rabadon's, a lot of times Rabadon's is actually a little bit better and more high value because it just the damage amp that it gives is a little bit better. And there's other items that you can make, but it's because it uses a glove component that it's pretty good, because the glove component is often hard to use in certain items and in certain builds because it's like an offensive item that doesn't have many options sometimes, but at the same time does have options but doesn't give you good base stats, so it's like but anyways, I digress. Bloodthirster, I think Bloodthirster is probably making / good. Like if you're playing well, actually it's more like situationally good, right? Because you have to play with a melee carry. That's the thing, right? Bloodthirster is really only good with melee carries. You can't really put on a backline unit. It doesn't really give stats. It's just like an Omnivamp tool, and it gives a protective shielding. You can sometimes put it on a tank, but it really doesn't do that much, so it's like Bramble Vest. Bramble Vest I'm going to put in the needs to justify tier. So Bramble Vest just gives you a massive amount of armor. It does give you some extra like damage that it can do in addition to that. But the main reason that you would make it is if a lot of your lobby is playing AD. If a lot of your lobby is playing AD, the little orange stat, then giving your team a bunch of armor, giving your tank a bunch of armor is really strong. Now, if your tank already has a bunch of armor, like they're a sentinel, it can feel like diminishing returns, and then you don't necessarily want to make the Bramble Vest on them. But at the same time, it's situational. You need to justify it though. If you look around and majority of your lobby is playing AD, then there's a good reason to make Bramble Vest. Otherwise, you might want to hold on to those components and maybe make some other items that might scale up a little bit better into your late game. There's not many items that you can make with the chainmail. It's one of those other components that's a little bit hard to use sometimes. A lot of the defensive components are like that, but I would still justify it first. If you're playing, like, for example, a mostly AP lobby, like, you know, there's like 2 Sork players and there's a Dominator player and then there's like a Morgana reroll. It's like, you know, you're literally getting no value off of the item besides like a little bit of extra HP scaling that it gives and a little bit of extra damage. So that's what I mean by you need to justify it. It's not like the other ones where they work or they give you a multitude of stats or they have a certain added effect that helps out your board. Blue buff. I think blue buff is in situationally good tier. There are some comps that are very reliant on blue buff. Blue buff is very situational for the actual unit that needs them. The way that it works with mana generation, I talk about in my item guide, but I'll give you a little crash course. Blue buff gives 10 mana after casting. So you usually want to put blue buff on a unit that has a very low mana threshold. It's usually like below 50 is like a good safe bet. Because it's just a way of generating mana and it gives a lot of stats. However, it does use 2 tiers, so it's hard to make. So if you make blue buff though, the comps that use it, usually you're not trying to itemize using another tier, so you have to be very careful about that because it can be harder to get repeat components. That's how TFT works. It's very hard to get repeat components. So that's why it's in situationally good. The units that need it, it's required. So I can't really put in the needs to justify tier because it's not something you can check and be like, maybe I make blue, but maybe I don't. It's like if you're playing Heimerdinger, if you're playing Morgana, if you're playing like those type of lines, you need to make a blue buff. So it's in that situationally good because it's like it's either like absolutely essential or you're not making it ever. That's like kind of the idea. Maybe I could put a needs to justify actually. That kind of sounds like needs to justify, right? You're either playing the comp that you absolutely need to make the blue buff, or you're not playing the comp and then it does absolutely nothing. So you have to be very careful about that. You can't just make a blue buff and hope that it works on a unit. It literally does nothing on most units. So it's in needs to justify. I think that's fair. It's in needs to justify. Even Shroud. So I feel like Even Shroud is okay. It's like it's somewhere in situationally good. So it is a utility item. Of the utility items, I think that it is not as strong as the other utility items. Because it doesn't have good backline access. So I really like the ones that have backline access primarily. I would put it in situationally good. I think that making an even shroud early is really strong. However, usually if you're making the item, you usually go for a last whisper instead of the even shroud because it's a little bit more direct, and we'll talk about it after. But you're usually only making even shroud not as a tank item. You're making it as a way of reducing armor. So it doesn't really do that well as a tank item. So often if you're looking for tankiness, it's often not good to make it. So that's why it's in situationally good, because if you need the armor reduction, then it's good. Decal, I'm also going to put need to justify tier. Same idea with Bramble. You're using 2 of the same components, so it's going to be really hard for you to have another cloak. So if you really don't need any cloaks, then it's good. If you're making it at the end of the game and it's just like slamming an item, that's fine. But often you have to look around, see if there's AP players in your lobby, or else it's going to be pretty useless. Crown Guard. I think Crown Guard is also... I think Crown Guard's situationally good. It uses good components, right? It's just a little bit awkward if you're playing around AP. You usually want to keep the rod for the backline. But Crown Guard's a generally pretty good item. It gives like a good amount of survivability in AP. A lot of the frontline tanks are AP tanks. They all have AP ratios, so Crown Guard works really well on most of them. And it gives a huge health shield, which is nice. There's also Crown Guarded, which can work out well, so that's also great. This one, Protector's Vow, I'm inclined to put it here. I think out of all of the tank items, I'm a big fan of Protector's Vow in a lot of units. Protector's Vow gives a lot of stats. It gives a good amount of survivability because it gives the HP shield, and it also allows for an early first cast with the mana generation. So a lot of times, well, actually, I'm not making it all the time. I'm gonna put it situationally good. The only problem with Protector's Vow is the fact that it uses a tier. A lot of times, if you're making a Protector's Vow, a lot of the comps where the units really like Protector's Vow, think Elise, think Alawi. It's like Giga broken on Alawi, Giga good on Elise. It's also really good on like a Vi sometimes if you're trying to get the Vi to stun multiple times and just like stall out your opponent. Like, it just helps your unit to cast earlier while also giving them a lot of defensive stats as well as survivability because it gives them an HP shield. So it's just a good item in general. The problem is that it uses a tier. So the tier, a lot of times you need it as a backline unit to cast. There's some lines where you don't need it at all, like maybe if you're playing Twitch and you're putting on a frontline unit there, it's fine, but it's awkward when it's awkward otherwise. So I'm almost always making it in certain situations, but in other situations I'm being very cautious because a lot of times I want to hold on to my tier to make sure I have my backline tier items. Giant Slayer I'm going to put in rarely. I rarely make Giant Slayer. I think it kind of feels understated in terms of the stats that it gives you. Basically uses a bow and a sword. The bow is a pretty high value component, so a lot of times I don't want to waste it on making a Giant Slayer unless I absolutely have to. Giant Slayer is mostly attack speed and damage amp, last I think. But it gives you a good mixture of stats because it uses the bow and the sword, so you have like a little bit of AD mixed in there as well, and then it also gives some AP. The problem is the condition is pretty bad for the damage amp. It's you need to hit units that have like 1700 HP or more, which isn't that bad, but I think it only applies on the units that it hits as well. It's just a little bit awkward. It's not as good because the condition is a little bit more like stingy compared to some of the other items, which is one that's coming up right now, which is Guardbreaker. So Guardbreaker, I put in the slamming tier. I almost always make Guardbreaker. I'm a Guardbreaker enjoyer. I fucking love this item. This item's broken as shit. I don't know what's going on. I wouldn't be surprised if they just nerf the shit out of Guardbreaker one of these patches because, like, holy, this item. There's many aspects of this item that are really good. Number one, it uses a glove. Glove items are a little bit awkward to make sometimes. So it's like a little bit like whatever. It's hard to say if you always make it, if that makes sense. With a glove, how do I phrase it? It's like some glove items are very situational one way or the other. Guardbreaker takes that glove item and makes it useful on both AP, AD, like no matter what your carry is. Guardbreaker is a decent item because it gives damage amp, it gives a mixture of stats, and it takes that glove and it allows you to increase your crit chance, which works well on auto attackers, and also has really good item pairings if you can make your ult also crit. So if you can make an IE or a dual gauntlet, often you're pairing it with Guardbreaker because you raise that crit chance to a point where it's very likely that when you cast your ult, you're going to get the crit with the ult. Because there's two aspects to the crit. There's the crit damage of the crit happening, but you have to realize the crit by having enough crit chance for it to happen. So that's where item pairings start to matter, which I talk about a lot in my guide. So if you're making an ult that crits build, Guard Breaker is a good second component because it usually complements the crit by giving damage amp, as well as using a glove and one belt, which the belt might be a little bit more useful if you're trying to make utility items, but it's a good use of components. You're basically taking a glove, which is hard to make an item for often, and a belt, which is like, you know, a general item that you can just use, usually for frontline, and you can just make a really strong backline item. Additionally, the damage amp conditions for Guard Breaker are pretty good. You just have to hit a shield, and then you get damage amp, and you're often gonna hit a shield. There's every unit, so many units that shield, so a lot of times you hit a shield, you get the Guard Breaker value, and bang, you're ready to go. It's good on Sorks, it's good on Visionaries, it's good on AP units, it's good on AD units. If you're making a crit build, a lot of times you can pair it up with like an IE Guard Breaker. You can go IE Guard Breaker on Jinx, on Twitch, on Caitlyn, right? It works really well both ways. And it's not that much of an investment, right? You're not like feeling the burn. It's not like you see a belt and a chain and you're like, oh no, how am I going to make my Bis Warmogs? It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, oh no, how am I going to make my Bis whatever? It's like the items that you're making are not necessarily the greatest items on any one particular unit with those components. So it's actually like just a good value, allows you to streak early. I almost always make it if I see it. Hopefully that justified it enough. I try my best to explain myself. Edge of Night. Situationally good. This thing can grief. You can't really use it as a frontline item. It's pretty much only for melee carries. I would actually put it a tier lower than Bloodthirster and the other thing. A lot of times when you have a melee carry, especially in the current meta, if you think about most of the melee carries, think like Vi, think Akali, think I don't know, give me another one. There's so many of them, but a lot of the times your melee carries, you want them to take damage. Unless they're diving the backline, like Mbessa, for example, where she just like ints and she just like jumps behind enemy lines and then everybody starts aggro toggling on her. It's very rare that you ever want to make this item because you want them to kind of drain tank a little bit. So it's very situational, even amongst melee users, right? It's not like Bloodthirster where it's good on like pretty much any frontline melee attacker would like Bloodthirster because it's just good survivability and you can even put on some tanks. Edge of Night, it's like half the tanks you don't want to put it on because you want them to like absorb some damage, or you're better off with just like giving them another means of like survivability, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like hit or you have to justify it. It's the same as like blue buff. It's like really good on the units that want it, but it's not that good on the units that don't, because sometimes you just like, you know, you have like imagine you put it on Vi and you're playing Enforcers. A lot of times you put Vi in the front line, you put Edge of Night on her, she gets de-aggroed, and then the enemy starts walking up and attacking like your Caitlyn and your backline units because you just Edge of Night procced and completely griefed your game because of it. Right? It's like unless the unit itself is specifically diving into the backline, it becomes really hard to make it work really well in certain builds. That's why I wouldn't put it in the same tier as situationally good. Guinsoo I'm putting in probably making / good. The reason I'm putting Guinsoo up there is because it's actually pretty flexible. There's quite a lot of builds that are okay with Guinsoo, right? Sorks are okay with Guinsoo. Twitch, obviously you need it. Even what's it called? I guess it's more of an auto attacker. I'm gonna put in situationally good. There's a lot less than I was thinking of when I originally saw it. It's kind of like, how do I phrase it? It's basically like the auto attacker item. It usually falls off late game, so it's a little hard to justify, but a lot of comps do use it, right? There's AD and AP options, there's reroll options that all kind of like Guinsoo, and it's not that bad on some other units that like attack speed. It's an okay use of components because you're using a bow, which usually you're taking bow items if you want to give attack speed to a user, and a rod. So sometimes even with AD comps, it works really well because it just kills the rod, which is often a hard item to deal with. If you're making an AD build, you don't want to necessarily always have AP items or AP components, because what do you do with them? So it's good in certain comps, but it's just like it's not that good of an item in general if your unit doesn't attack really fast or attack a lot. So it's not as unflexible as something like a blue buff, but it's like pretty like, you know, it's pretty like, yeah, you know what I mean? It's very middling on many units, right? Unless it's an auto attacker specifically, like a Zeri or a Twitch, or even a Zoe in certain like Sork builds. I'm sure there's other options, but you know what I'm trying to say. Hand of Justice, I put it in probably making... No, I'll put it here. It's pretty much just a melee item. You can put it in backline as well because it has a little bit better synergies with like crit chance and more damage. So it's a little bit better than Bloodthirster, but I don't think it gets to that probably making / good tier. Gunblade, also in situationally good. It's an Omnivamp item. Actually can work on a lot of backline units. I'm kind of down to make no. It's because of the components that it uses. A lot of times you have to like justify making Gunblade. It's not as bad as some of these items, but it's still in the same tier of like situationally good. IE, probably making just good use of components, and you make your ult crit. So if you're playing around AD, often IE you can't really go wrong. There's some users that really hate IE, like somebody like Draven, for example. He's pretty bad with IE just because of the way his kit works. The ults don't properly crit in a way that's like meaningful. To realize its full potential, you'd rather just have him like have more attack speed or more damage, but it's okay. It's fine on most users like Corki, Twitch. It just scales up your damage pretty well, and it uses a glove, so that's good. Spark, I put Spark in probably making. So Spark is just a good use of components. It has a pretty good value for what it is. It's basically sundering, or sorry, it's basically shredding, so it reduces magic resist. Often if I have early game Spark components, it's really good for streaking, but it's not as like bad in a lot of cases. Maybe it's in the same tier. I'm gonna move Even Shroud up, probably making / good. I just like utility, so I moved up Even Shroud. If you guys watched it before, Even Shroud has moved up. So if you see Spark and you're like, why is Spark above Even Shroud, I put Even Shroud with it. It's like, it's decent use of the components. I like the components that Spark uses a little bit better than with Even Shroud, because Even Shroud you're using the belt, and the belt you can make like backline items. It's a little bit more flexible, so that's why I wanted to put a separation, but there's not enough of a gap for me to put it, so I'm putting in the probably making. Stone Plate, I think Stone Plate you would put in a situationally, no, I would put it in needs to justify. So Stone Plate, you can slam it, but a lot of times it's like, actually it's not as bad as these ones. I'll put it in situationally good. So Stone Plate isn't as bad as like, it gives you both senses of resistances. It gives you some of both sides of the resistances, like some MR, some AD resistances, like armor and MR. And it gives you a little bit of HP. But the thing is, it's just like, it's not like, I'm not probably making it because of those components. I might want to make better items. It's just like, you know, it's situationally good. It's pretty good. It's really good if you have a solo frontline tank. No matter what the solo frontline tank is, you get a lot of value if you have everybody targeting, because you get more armor and MR per unit that's targeting the unit. So often it's really good if you're playing like a reroll comp and you're playing a solo frontline carry. But, you know, I would be a little bit more cautious about that. Even Shroud. Oh, this is why I wanted Even Shroud down. I really like Last Whisper. So Last Whisper, I like it a lot more than Even Shroud, but I'll just put them in the same tier because they're really good to help you streak early. It's just a really good item. A lot of times if you have backline access, you can use the Last Whisper. It's definitely better than Even Shroud, so I'll just put it up here. Deathblade. I think Deathblade you need to justify. Getting a bunch of AD is really good, but you kill both your swords, and often you can make many AD items with it. There's a common trend of whenever you use two of the same components, you often have to justify it because it can be hard to get those other components in another way. So especially with like a sword is a really good way to kill other items. So if you use both of them to make a Deathblade, you gotta be careful. You gotta justify it. Archangels I would also put on the needs to justify, because a lot of times with Archangels, you need to have a really strong front line in order for this to actually have any value. You're better off using the Rod in the tier to make other AP items. And a lot of comps actually don't like Archangels, so it's not even that good on many units. So you have a lot less flexibility. It's very committable. It's similar to like blue buff. If you make an Archangels, you know that you're playing like some sort of like really tanky visionary line or something like that. It's not something you can easily use or make. Morello, I'll put in the situationally good. It's anti-heal, but the components that it uses might be a little bit awkward sometimes. Nashers, I'm going to put in needs to justify. Nashers used to be a very easy, quick, always make kind of item. However, not anymore. The problem with Nashers now is that AP flex isn't as good, and for a lot of the AP lines, the way that they have worked out and buffed and changed, the Nasher is actually really low value. It gives a burst of attack speed when you cast, so it helps you like chain cast and work really well. But really the only comp that wants to make like a Nashers is like somebody who does like Shojin Nashers, because that's a really good item pairing. And the way everything has worked out to be right now, that's pretty much just Dominators. Before, Shojin Nashers was good on like everybody. You just made it and you just rocked Shojin Nashers and you just played either a Heimer or Zoe or Silco, and that was like AP flex. But as things got optimized and as comps kind of diverged through patches, it's kind of awkward. So it's somewhere over there. QSS, I put in the needs to justify. It's pretty good to just give you a burst of attack speed. It's really good on certain units, but it's just like a really awkward item to make because it doesn't do all that much. Right? It's not as much attack speed if you're going for pure attack speed. It's not that much survivability. It's pretty much anti-stun. If you look around and you think that I really need my unit to not get stunned, then QSS is a good item to make. But it's something that requires some justification. It's not something that's giga broken. It's something that's really good late game because a lot of times, like, you know, if you want to get around a Victor, a QSS is a great way to do that. But it's like you want to justify it if you're making it early. You don't just want to start the game and slam QSS because that kind of means that you're probably going to be playing melee and you're probably not going to be able to play very greatly around backline carry if you're already using your components like that. So it's hard to say. Rabadon's also in the need to justify tier. The Rabadons uses 2 rods. Whenever you use 2 of the same components, you have to expect that you're not going to see many of that component again in the future. If you're playing around an AP comp and you make Rabadons, it is a really good item. Even on Sorks, some Sork units, it's really good on the stats for them, but obviously that's skewed by being high roll. But like, it gives a bunch of AP, which sometimes might be diminishing returns, so you might not want to make it. But then also, your item economy is shot because, you know, if you have a rod, that's how you make AP items. So if you're playing an AP caster, if you're playing somebody who wants to use a Rabadons, like, what do you do with your other components, right? Like, a rod can kill a sword, you can make a gunblade, you can make a Morello, you can make a spark, you can make a jewel gauntlet. Like, there's so many items you can make that it's going to be really hard for you to make the other items. So it's a very high roll item to make, which is why you really need to justify. If you get dropped 2 rods at the start of the game, do you just look at yourself and you're like, oh, I guess I'm making a Rabadon? It's like, no, it's like you're probably playing AP and you're going to use those 2 rods to deal with the other components. Because then what happens if you make Rabadons and then your next 2 items are sword, glove? You're making Rabadons fucking IE for your Zoe? Like, I don't know, right? It becomes really difficult. Then you have to worry about mixed carries, and then, you know what I mean? Like, it's really good. What Rabadons works really well in is something like Scrap, right? Because with Scrap, a lot of times you're itemizing for like a Corki, so you're making like an IE, you're making a Last Whisper, you're making a Guard Breaker, and then if you have any rods, you could put Rabadons really easy on Echo, who scales it up with Ambusher, so giving him a bunch of AP is really strong, or Rumble, who scales really well off a bunch of AP. So it's like that's somewhere where you don't get punished because you don't need to make a lot of AP items because you have like mixed carries. That's where Rabadons is really good, but that's what I mean by you need to justify it otherwise, because like it has to be in those particular spots. Same with red buff, right? Red buff, you're making 2 bows into a anti-heal item. It is a good burst of attack speed. It is quite good, don't get me wrong. It's really good late game because a lot of times Guinsu doesn't stack as high, so red buff just gives you like that initial burst of speed, which is nice. But I would just be careful. This is situationally good. Redemption, it looks a little bit different because I don't know, they're using an old picture. I'll put in situationally good. Runans is not that good on most units. I think it's only good on a couple units. I would put in needs to justify because you're using a bow in a way that otherwise you would want to use like in another way. It's really good for spreading damage if you're using a Guinsu user, so it does fit into certain boards well, but I think you just need to justify it. Oh, I didn't talk that much about Rabadon. I think I skipped over it. But basically, it's like you're using a tier. It's the same idea as Adaptive Helm and Protector's Vow. It's really good on certain units, helps in the cast because it gives them a little bit of starting mana. It has a really good bonus effect of like healing around your allies based on percentage health. So it has like this good survivability aspect to your team, and it also gives durability. However, it uses a tier, so that's why it's situationally good. It would probably be a little bit higher if I wanted to, but you know, it is what it is. Shiv, I would put in needs to justify. Actually, I'll put in needs to justify. It uses a tier, so you're using a tier to make an item. Like, how do I phrase this, right? You're using a tier, which often, if you're making a Shiv, means that you're playing an AP line. AP lines all need some sort of mana generation. There's very few AP lines that don't need mana generation. The only one is like Zoe you can get away with like a Gwinsu. Maybe there's one or two other ones, but besides the point, it's like if you're using a tier to make the Shiv and then you don't get dropped another tier, your unit's not going to cast. So who cares if you have Shred or not? So you're better off usually making your Shred with a Spark. That's just the better way to do that. So that's why it's in needs to justify. It's like only if you have a lot of tiers. Now, mind you, it is very strong because it hits the back line, right? So like Last Whisper, a lot of times like you're using a bow for that, which, you know, but it's still an attack speed item, so it still works on auto attackers. If you have like usually auto attackers, you need multiple bow items anyways, so it is a common item to make. But the problem with Shiv is that maybe we'll move it up one. I'll move it. I'm convincing myself that it's situationally good. Hitting the backline is incredibly strong for a lot of boards because it allows you to snipe the backline a lot more easily. So we're going to move it up just because of its backline access, but it's not in the probably making / good tier because of the fact that it uses a tier. Does that make sense? Using a tier, your casters can't cast, you're making a shift to help your casters. There's a little bit of anti-synergy there, so you have to be a little bit careful. I would say that you need to justify it, but I'm going to move it up because of how powerful its effect is of shredding the backline. That's the only reason it's getting applied to situationally good. Steadfast, situationally good. It's one of the few items. Like I know that I say like a glove is hard to make items with, but all the glove items are individually situational. So I know that I keep saying, oh yeah, this is a glove item, so this is a good item to make because it kills a glove. It's like the glove items are all very situational, and that's the thing that's bad about them. Like, even Steadfast is really situational. It doesn't give that many stats, and its bonus effect isn't that great, especially if you're playing Watchers. It gives durability, so then there's diminishing returns there. It works well on some comms, but it's not that powerful. The good part about it is that it gets rid of your glove and your chainmail, which are two bad components, so you just make a mid item out of those. Sterex, I think, is also in situationally good, similar to the other melee items. It works really well on certain units. Unleash the Beast can also work well. Gives good survivability, good stats, good tanking. However, it needs to be on a particular style of unit, so that's why it's in situationally good. Sunfire, I'm going to put Sunfire in probably making / good. I almost always slam Sunfire. Just because it's really good for early game tempo. Now, Sunfire used to be a shit item. If you're a veteran TFT player who has played multiple sets in the past and you didn't play much of this set, they did buff Sunfire from previous sets to this set. That's why everybody makes Sunfire nowadays. I saw this chat message a lot when I would watch streamers, even as much as yesterday. I saw somebody saying like, why does everybody make Sunfire this set? Isn't this item shit? And it's like, well, yeah, it used to be shit. It gives a little bit of percentage max health now. That's the buff that it got from the previous sets to this set. So now it actually functions a little bit like a tank item. So it gives you a little bit of HP. It gives you a little bit of scaling HP with the percentage max HP buff. And it gives you a little bit of armor because it's made with a chainmail. So it has some tank stats, but then it also gives you the anti-heal. So the anti-heal is really great because this is just one way of getting rid of it. Now, the other opportunity to make anti-heal is Morello and, Red buff. Morello and Red buff are really good to access the backline. Sunfire isn't that good late game, but if I have to make an early game item, it's a good use of components. Chainmail, like Glove, I think Glove and Chainmail are two of the worst items. Glove, Chainmail, and Cloak are like three of the items that components where you're like some of these items are really hard to make. Like, you know, think if you start the game off with Glove, Cloak, Chain. Like, what do you make, right? It's like you pretty much have to either make Steadfast. QSS is very situational, right? Like the item slams are awkward, to say the least, right? And then Gargoyle is, like, okay, but then, like, sometimes it doesn't work out well. Sunfire is just great because it's a good use of components. It gives you utility. And it kind of applies that chainmail in a way that's, like, you don't have to worry about it in the future as much. So we'll put in probably making. Thieves Gloves, I'm going to put it in situationally good. If you have two gloves, it's a great way to just get some items, a bit RNG, so you got to be careful about that. Titans, I would put in the situationally good. If you're making a drain tank melee user, it's pretty good nowadays. And then the last one is Shojin. Shojin I'm putting in the probably making. Almost always, if you get dropped a tier, it's very hard for you to make a blue buff, so you're often making a Shojin with the tier, or you're making a frontline item. But if you're making any backline item that needs mana generation, a lot of times Shojin is not the strongest of items, but it's the item that you're usually like, well, I can't go wrong making these, right? Now, if you look at these items, there's something I want to be very clear about. these items, for a large portion of them, you can almost flip this tier list to say, hey, these items are like in the reverse order for some of them, right? Like, I guarantee you, if you show this to anybody who's really good at the game, they're gonna be like, Jewel Gauntlet, i.e. Shojin, this item, Sunfire, Even Shroud, like these are all shit items, right? Like there's so many better items in the game. Like why would you ever make Jewel Gauntlet? Rabadon's is such a better item. It's like, yes, I understand that. The point is that I'm saying is like, if you have early game components and you have to make items, if I have a rod and a glove, I am making a Jewel Gauntlet, right? I'm not sitting there, I'm not saying, I'll just sit here and not make these items, right? If I start my game off and I have a cloak and a chain, a belt, and I have like an AD opener, I'm probably making Even Shroud. It's going to save me a lot of HP. It's going to make me pretty strong in my early game. It's also really good if you need to get like Tristana stacks, like stuff like that. It just works out really well. These are items where it's like, if I start my game off and I have these components, a lot of times I'm taking these components and I'm looking at myself and I'm saying, if I have a spot for it, I'm probably making it. If I have these items, I'm almost always making Guard Breaker. And then a lot of these are situational. It's like, do I have a situation where I want to make these and I want to play around these items? Like, for example, a Bloodthirster, right? A Bloodthirster is way more forcing to make than something like a IE or a Last Whisper, because these ones are just general. You could put an IE on a frontline unit, you could put a Last Whisper on a frontline unit, you can put these on backline units as well. But a Bloodthirster, you're pretty much saying, hey, I'm playing a frontline unit. I'm playing a frontline unit that needs this Bloodthirster. So it's a little bit more forcing. And then these ones that need to justify, a lot of them are really good on certain units. If you look here, like QSS Nashers, this is Mordekaiser Biss. Why is it needs to justify? Well, the justification is, do I have a Mordekaiser? You know what I mean? And then Giant Slayer is in the rarely tier. I'm pretty happy with this. Hopefully that made some sense. I explained a little bit the items and the thought process. I think that's the entertaining part of the video. I'm sure I'm going to get 100 comments telling me how I'm wrong and how dare you put certain things in other tiers where they should be in other tiers and blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you now, sure, whatever, to each their own. Like I said, this was mostly for fun. I made it very clear. I feel like I'm being very reasonable in my explanations of stuff. And I feel like, if you know what I mean, it's fine. But thank you. Sorry about today. That is not a full-on guide. I'm very busy. I was playing Monster Hunter today on stream, and then I have some other stuff to do tonight. So I just wanted to bang out one of these little chill videos that I have a little list of requests that people had. There's some other requests that I'm working on, like talking about enablers. That was one that we got last week. Talking about different positioning for countering comps and how comps counter each other. So that's another guide that I'm working on. Those ones take a little bit more time. And then how to not be hard stuck. That's another thing. And then unit drip tier list. I do that once a set, so I'll probably do that at one point when I have like a busy day. But stay tuned for those. Of course, tomorrow we're going to talk about the patch, though. I think tomorrow is patch day, so I'm going to say like the top comps of the patch. That's going to be tomorrow night's video, and then after that, we'll see where it takes us. Thank you for watching. Hopefully, have a great day, and see ya. Bye-bye.